Hello everyone, Memory here. I really have no idea what to call this build. It is pretty much a Greedman's first attempt of making a tank build. Now this is far from an all-content build since I have limited resource to build it, but I think it is a build that people can either learn something or get build inspiration from. I've only managed to hit tier 60 map with this build, mainly because it is lacking some damage. But if you also consider the fact that it only costs 5x to complete, it is not too bad as a build on first try. Okay, enough with the intro, let's start with the offensive side of the build because it is the easiest part of the build to explain. I ended up settling with Bleed Lacerate because Gladiator is the easiest class to max block, and spell suppression together, with a decent amount of armor on top of that. And since Gladiator is the only class that has bleed related ascendancy passives, and I've never touched a real bleed build before, so I ended up taking it. And I picked Lacerate over other bleed related skills like Blade Storm just because it looks cool. For weapons, I used Rigward's Midnight Blade for the damage over time multiplier for bleed per rage. This build has 80 maximum rage, so this sword gives us 80% bleed DOT multiplier. And since we need to dual wield an axe to trigger the effects, we use Jack the Axe because it gives us the Thirst for Blood skill, which increases bleed damage and gives us life regen based on the number of bleeding enemies around you. You're not gonna get a stronger rare weapons than these two uniques with the same price. I cherry picked both of them and they are still at most 10 chaos each, which is the best deal to grab for a casual player like myself. And since we're messing around with rage, we are also using the Bear's Greater Belt. For skill links, I've got Anomalous Lacerate because it is dirt cheap since it is an off-meta skill. Divergent Chance to Bleed because it gives us a significant more damage than the normal version, and it happens to be fairly cheap as well. Rage Support to build Rage, Cruelty for the damage over time buff, and finally melee physical damage and Brutality for the raw damage increase. To gain Rage even faster, I've got Riposte and Vengeance linked with another Rage support. This link will double your average Rage gain speed in practice. I've also linked a Culling Strike here, which ended up being surprisingly useful since this character is lacking some damage. And because we're lacking damage, I've used 5 offensive auras on this build, and they are Flesh and Stone linked with Main, so that the Main from the Blood stance has increased effect, Precision and War Banner for the accuracy, Malevolence for more DOT damage, and also the Thirst for Blood mentioned above for more bleed damage. I've also used Ancestral Protector and Blood Rage for attack speed, so we can stack everything faster. And of course, the vulnerability on hits on our ring is a must as well. For the passive tree, the jewel over here is very important because of the mana leech. This is the only source of mana leech for this build, and without it, it simply won't function. I'd suggest finding any jewels that has mana leech, dex, and cannot inflict corrupted blood. If you have the extra resource, then go for life and damage. Why dex, you might ask? Because it gives us spell suppression, which I will talk more about later. The other important offensive related passives to get are Crimson Dance for more bleed stacks, Berserking over here for the max rage, and Gratuitous Violence for the exploity effect. Okay, now for the defensive side of the build. Let's start with how we are sustaining Fortify while fighting bosses as a bleed build. The 3.16 Fortify change made Fortify into stacks. Yes, more things for us to stack on this build, but compared to the rage stacks, this won't be too much of an issue to sustain, so don't worry. Anyways, you need to reach 20 stacks in order to have the same effect as the old Fortify. And to get stacks, they've used a similar formula as ailments, where the more hit damage you do relative to the enemy's max life, the more stacks you get. What that means is, builds like Bleed Lacerate, which has very low hit damage, especially going against bosses, will get 0 stacks, even if you invest heavily into increased fortification gains. So you will need to get the Fortify Mastery that guarantees 1 stack on melee hits, and the Steadfast notable here to get your max Fortify to over 20. so that the Rampart nerd ball can be triggered. You also want the increased Fortify duration mastery because the stack decays quickly when the buff timer reaches the halfway point. Now with these two passive circles, you don't need to get Fortify support on any of your links because 99% of the time you will have max Fortify when you need it, just by having these two passive circles alone. Next defense layer we have block. We're using versatile combatant, so the extra block chance will be converted into spell block, but at a cost, we have lower max block chance. But that's okay, because we will end up with more overall block chance if we take this keystone. I have 60% block, which is the max with this keystone, and that means Rumi's Flask gives me 29% to spell block, which will cap my spell block at 50%. And then we have Blade Barrier, Swagger, Dervish, and the Anointed Dark Arts for the block chance while dual wielding. And of course, we have the Reigning Veteran Ascendancy passive for 10% increase to max block and some extra armor and evasion. Speaking of armor and evasion, we can't just use pure armor based gears because only evasion based gears can roll spell suppression. And we don't want to get pure evasion based gear as well because most of our gems are strength gems. That's why I choose to get armor and evasion hybrid gears. But because it's very difficult to get enough evasion to the point where it is worth getting, so converting all evasion into armor using Iron Reflex and have straight damage reduction is the way to go. This means the Jade Flask is basically a second Granite Flask, giving us another huge boost to armor. And this is how we can reach around 20,000 armor while only having the Inexorable passive on the skill tree that gives us armor. Now 2000 armor alone is not gonna get you 90% physical damage reduction. It's probably somewhere around 75 to 80%. But with the help of the endurance charges you get from the Inexorable passive, you can get very close to 90%. The last few percent of physical damage reduction is gained from Crystal Vault on paper, where 20% of physical damage is taken as cold damage. Yes, it does sound like cheating, and yes, I have higher physical damage reduction than elemental resistance, so converting them to elemental damage will actually increase my overall damage taken by around 2 to 3%. But this 6-link Crystal Vault is 30 chaos when I picked it up, and it solved my resistance and intelligence problem, while also making me immune to chill. On top of that, it has 30% of fire damage taken as cold damage, which is good because that means 30% of fire damage taken are immune to fire resistance reduction, like being cursed by flammability. I get all that. In exchange, I only have to take 2 to 3% increase incoming damage, which sounds like a good deal for this build. Next up, we talk about another damage conversion that I use on this build, and that is Divine Flesh, where 50% of elemental damage are taken as chaos damage and it gives us 5% to max chaos resistance. So that means not only 50% of incoming elemental damage are immune to elemental resistance reduction or penetration, but also that 50% of elemental damage are resisted by 80% resistance instead of 75. Now, as mentioned above, we have 30% fire damage taken as cold, so we are already very good at taking fire damage. To do the same with cold and lightning damage taken, we use Sapphire and Topaz flasks and take 20% less damage from those two elements. This is how we are very tanky against elemental damage. As for chaos damage, we have 80% chaos resistance from Divine Flesh, and that alone already makes Awakener 8 Alhazman a joke. It is also enough to ignore the side effect from the Forbidden Taste. And yes, we are using Forbidden Taste with the use when taking savage hits enchant, because that allows us to tank 2 more big hits that does not one-shot this character. And so far, I have not run into any damage that can one-shot this character yet, because most of the big hit damage in this game comes from spells, which brings us to the last defensive mechanism, spell suppression. Maxing spell suppression means we take 50% less spell damage at all times. So on the skill tree, we have this passive circle that gives us spell suppression, evasion, and accuracy. And also the Mage Bane keystone next to it that gives us spell suppression instead of evasion from Dex. And that is the whole reason of why we have the 30 Dex passive over here, some Dex on this jewel mentioned above, as well as on our amulet. Together, they give me just enough Dex to reach 100% spell suppression. Of course, I have spell suppression on my boots, helmets, and gloves. They all gotta have at least tier 2 spell suppression on them. If you can get tier 1, then you probably won't need the extra Dex mentioned above. Now I also need decent life and chaos resistance and a tier 2 or tier 1 elemental resistance on those gears, which actually makes them the most expensive part of the build, sitting at 1 exalt each. So as you can see, we have high resistance against physical, elemental, and chaos damage. On top of that, we have Fortify, spell suppression, block, and molten shell to reduce hit damage taken. The key word here is hit damage. This build is relatively weak against damage over time. The only thing I have against damage over time is the 10% DOT reduction mastery over here. I've got Vitality, Stone Golem, and Vitality Watcher's Eye for around 400 life regen per second. Against bosses, Thirst for Blood gives me another 400 life regen. This is definitely not enough to tank the stronger damage over time mechanics that the game has to offer, like the Poison Pool in the Al Hasman boss fight, or any DOT skills on any bosses. It's also not good at sustaining continuous hit damage that is strong enough to damage us. For example, the Cyrus Die Beam or the Ice Machine Gun from the Redeemer. If there is a way to hyper regenerate life at all times, especially while fighting bosses, then this build can become almost invincible. After all, this character can tank tier 16 Scourge mobs with 3300 life, no problem. Because there are many bleeding enemies around, so the Thirst for Blood gives us 2000 life regen per second instead of the 400 while fighting bosses. The other weakness for this build is of course the damage. Investing this much into defense means it's not gonna be doing too great on the damage department. What it struggles with the most are the endgame bosses, especially ones like Cyrus and Maven, where they have multiple phases, because you will have to restack everything after each stage, which will essentially halve your already low DPS. But it does have enough damage to kill normal bosses within a decent amount of time, and it has just bearable amount of map clear potential after you get the gratuitous Violence Ascendancy for the Explodey effect. It can do Awakener 8 tier 16 maps, the Conquerors, and it can handle the Scourge mobs quite easily as well. Overall, this is a 5 exalt build that can get you to tier 16 maps, so I'm happy enough with the build to move on to the next one. Anyways, that's it for today. Subscribe for extra mirror drop chance. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.